Welcome to the Stories Told podcast. This is episode 90. The Sun Yet Shines. This is the Stories Told podcast. Two authors talking about stories in movies, TV, and of course, books.
I'm Michael Grayford. I write action-adventure stories in fantasy and sci-fi worlds, sometimes for younger readers and sometimes for adults. And I try to always inject at least a little bit of humor.
And I am author E.W. Barnes, and I write action-adventure, time travel novels, and space opera science fiction. Thousands of years, thousands of worlds. But be forewarned, beyond here, there will be spoilers. Are you ready for the adventure? Let's begin. Welcome back to the Stories Told podcast. I'm author E.W. Barnes, and with me is author Michael Grayford. And today we're talking about the story told in the television series Rings of Power Season 2. How are you doing today, Mike?
I'm doing quite well. How are you?
Doing well, thank you. And what's new in your writing world?
In my writing world, not too much. I've just been playing catch up on miscellaneous things, organizing notes, planning stuff to come, waiting to get feedback from the editor. That's it. What's going on in your writing world?
Same old, same old. I'm working on plot elements for Meridian. So I wanted to sort of map out some of the plot elements that I really wanted to work on before I started working on the next chapter. So that's what I've been focused on. That's pretty much it.
All right.
So what interesting stories have you come across lately in books, movies, or television?
Let's see. I've been reading a Timothy Zahn story called Ghost Riders in the Sky. I guess it's a novella. I thought it was a book.
Okay.
But it looks like it's only 70 pages, something like that.
Okay.
It's a sci-fi story about this guy who is like a pilot for hyperspace travel, which humans can only use this technology that was created by aliens. But humans can only control it through people who can perform astral projection. So he's one of these people.
Okay.
He's one of these people who can control it. And they are looking for a way to do it so that they're not reliant on alien technology. Because right now, like, they're restricted by what these other people tell them to do. So I'm just getting started in it, but it seems pretty cool. Interesting idea.
Good. I'm glad you're enjoying it.
Have you encountered any cool stories in the last week or so?
I'm still reading The Truce at Bakura by Kathy Tyers, which is a Star Wars novel, and still enjoying that. There is one part of the novel that I'm not crazy about, and I was giving myself, I wanted to think about what I didn't like about it. It is, and I'm not going to try to give away too many spoilers, but what it's related to is I realized I don't like story elements where there is a situation of an illness, disease, or some kind of infection that is uncurable that then gets cured. And I realized I really dislike that because that feels a lot like hand waving without any logic. And I'm not talking about like, oh, they're rushing to find a cure and they at the last minute find the right, combination of antivirus or antibacteria or whatever. I'm talking about other kinds of, I'm curing this through this particular strength that I have. But I realize that's very common with me. And I think that's one of the reasons why I don't like zombie movies. Because the mechanism of the existence of the zombies makes just so much no sense to me. I can't get over it.
Yeah. No, I agree. For me, like a zombie story that is interesting is something like 28 Days Later, where I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's
No.
It's almost like fast acting rabies, where instead of the slow shambling zombies, they're like basically makes people super aggressive and they go just attack anything. Versus, I want to eat your brains, and you're the undead. It's not. Yeah. They're not really undead. They're just infected. It's a different kind of thing.
Okay. It's sort of just like a pandemic, but with sort of a brain reaction.
Yeah.
A behavioral reaction. Okay. Cool. Anyway, so I'm reading that. It's still a good story, so I don't want anybody to think that I'm not enjoying the story. When I was just realizing because I've read this story before, and when I came across a particular character issue, I was like, oh, I remember this. I don't like this. And then I sat down and said, why don't you like that?
Yeah.
What about that particular plot choice don't you like? And I realized that's what I don't like about it. So it was really interesting to sort of sit down and analyze it from that perspective. And then I finished Agatha All Along. That completed this week. And at the time of recording of the podcast, this is the end of October. That was good. I'm glad I finished that. And I think that's it.
Yeah, I also saw a few like horror thriller stories on Hulu and Netflix, but they were not worth discussing.
Okay.
It's like,
then we will not.
You're like 5-10 minutes in. I'm like, nah, I'm done. I'm out.
And we are kind of sticking with our Halloween-ish sort of feeling, even though by the time this is published, Halloween will be over.
Yeah.
Because our next podcast is going to be about Agatha All Along, because we wanted to record it after the series was completed. So we're still kind of in a little Halloween mode. And I will tell you that my spouse and my offspring did watch a couple of horror movies in anticipation of Halloween. And they watched The Shining, which my offspring was not particularly bothered by nor real impressed with.
Yeah.
The comment was, cabin fever so extreme doesn't make that much sense. There was a realism there that was missing for my offspring. And then my offspring sat down to watch Hellraiser, and I think they got about half an hour into it, and then they were like, nope, can't do it. They just were not enjoying it, so they shut that off.
Yeah. Very different. Very different movie.
And so I think the next one, if they continue to decide to watch some scary movies, which they may just decide to do even though Halloween is over, the next one I think that's on the playlist is It. And I've seen the old It with Tim Curry.
Yeah.
And I'd seen The Shining. And I have the same feeling about both of them, which was, okay, yeah, I saw it and I don't need to see it again. They'll watch the movie and I'll disappear and go do something else.
Yeah, they're going to watch the new version of It.
Yeah. So we'll see how that goes. I understand that one's a little bit more brutal. So than the one back in, I don't know, what was that, the 90s, 80s?
80s maybe,
with Tim Curry?
something like that.
Yeah.
I don't think I ever saw that
anyway.
one, the old one.
It was creepy, but it was also, well, I'm not going to say anything else. I'm going to I'll report what they have to say, but other people have seen it and they can have their own opinions on that. They don't need to hear mine.
Yeah.
So
the interesting take on The Shining being to be more realistic. I think maybe that, or more obviously supernatural, which is kind of where it was going, which you get a sense for at the end with like the photo or something, like this place is like,
I agree,
people in over time, and like,
and I think because that wasn't there, my offspring was sort of like, this behavior doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it's a little over the top without understanding like the supernatural psychosis or something. I'm not sure what was going on in that movie. I haven't seen it in a long time.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think just a little bit of clarification in the storytelling would have made that, I'm going to buy into this particular rationale for this particular world and this story. I think that would have helped. So
I actually liked the sequel a lot more, Dr. Sleep. I thought that was more interesting, more engaging for me.
Okay, I'll mention that. Are you ready to talk about Rings of Power Season 2?
Oh yeah, let's go.
Today we're talking about the story told in the television series Rings of Power Season 2. And I'm going to read the brief synopsis that you can find on Wikipedia. The Rings of Power is based on J.R.R. Tolkien's history of Middle-earth, primarily material from the appendices of the novel Lord of the Rings. Set thousands of years before the novel in the Second Age of Middle-earth, the season depicts the rise of the Dark Lord Sauron and the creation of more Rings of Power. So did you like this season?
Yeah, I thought the season was very good. I didn't know what to expect watching, getting into Rings of Power as a whole. Like I said, I'm not familiar with the background mythology of the Tolkien universe. So I didn't have any particular attachment toward it or affinity for it or anything like that. So I have to say I've been very pleasantly surprised. This series has been much better than I thought it would be, which probably isn't fair because I didn't know. But they're obviously taking it very seriously. It's a very well done show. Production values are very good, which doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the writing, but I do think the writing is good. There's a lot of elements that I really enjoyed in this season. I think, like you said the last time when we discussed the first season, there's a lot of things that they set up in season one that either gets paid off or comes to fruition or gets expanded on in season two. It really makes me respect the writing even more from the first season to see how they dealt with it, in this season. Yeah, there's a lot of good things this time around. I love that we see King Durin being affected by the ring. I thought that was handled quite well. And then I love that he finally wakes up at the end and takes responsibility for his actions and realizes his son was right. And we get to see, of course, Durin's bane come to reality, come to fruition. We get to see that moment, which was fun. And likewise with Celebrimbor, he was great. We get to see his slow descent as he's being more and more controlled and manipulated by Sauron. I remember wondering, like, how did this get created, right? If an elf made these rings, like, how was that set up? And I think they did that really well here. They create a lot of situations for characters where they're facing these impossible decisions, and the bad decisions that they make seem like the most reasonable decision at the time. Like, this is the lesser of two evils, right? You can at least empathize with the harsh reality that they're facing. So I like the way that they handled that. And again, I like the way that Celebrimbor finally woke up at the end and realized what he had done and faced down Sauron. So those I thought were very good moments. I was heartbroken for poor Elrond when he's there at the battle waiting for Durin to show up. He's like, oh, Durin's going to show up. Durin's going to show up. And he doesn't show up. It's like, oh, poor Elrond. He had that strong friendship and relationship. And it's like, and it was done so well because you don't blame Durin for not showing up. He was facing his own harsh decision that he had to make. And he did the right thing and the best thing for himself at the moment. So the writers are very good at creating those harsh decisions for characters. I really like that. And I thought overall the machinations of Sauron were impressive. You don't really get to see it in the first season or even somewhat in the early part of this season, but you see how much he's wormed his way into people's minds by the end and how he controls things via the rings, how he set everything up. Yeah, I thought they handled that pretty well. And even like the dwarves, I liked how they were in this dire situation, right? They're cut off from the outside world. They had no light coming in there for plants and food. It was drying up, all these things. So they were willing to listen to whoever might be able to save them. And, oh, here, these rings will help you. Okay, well, might as well give that a try, right? So, like all these, the way that the rings were like injected into their lives because of the terrible consequences they faced if they didn't use them is really smart. So I really like the way they set that up. And with King Durin, I like how they set up where but he comes to not respect his son or his son's opinion right before the rings even come along, so that when the ring starts to overtake him, it's believable that he doesn't listen to his son at that point. They did a great job of setting that up. Let's see, what are some other things? The treachery that takes place in Numenor, I think, was set up fairly well in the first season. You don't get too much overtly from what I remember, but you definitely get the sense that Pharazôn, or whatever his name is, Evil Jack Black, is kind of working. He's kind of working behind the scenes. You get a sense like, okay, this guy's trying to set himself up to be a position of power, right? And then more and more as the story goes on, you see, until eventually he takes over. So I think they did a pretty good job of setting that up. And then with the failure of the Queen's mission and the loss of the lives of the Numenorians who went over, and then the Queen being blinded, I think it's all believable that when she comes back, people are kind of disenchanted with her and disheartened about what happened. And especially with her being blind now, and then the introduction of the Palantir, you can see again how the people would turn, and you almost can't blame them. It's like, okay, I can see where they're coming from. I see the logic and I see the rationale for wanting to go with this other person who kind of has a claim to the throne. I guess he's like a cousin or something from what I remember. But again, that's set up so well and it's so believable. And they just laid the foundation and set up the dominoes so that they fell one by one by one, where it gets you to this point where something happens, right? You're not rooting for him, you're rooting for the queen, but you get it. You understand why things are happening the way they are. And it feels, if not justified, at least understandable. But I think they do a great job of setting things up like that. Or, setting up the hard choices, with Durin, like Prince Durin having to overthrow his father and claiming the mountain, and then setting out to save his friend, but then he can't. All those things are really good. Even Adar, right, the head of the orcs, or the Uruks, as he prefers, he actually kind of speaks some logical sense from his standpoint. He truly wants to get rid of Sauron, and he presents a seemingly reasonable option. It's like, look, give me this ring so I can defeat him. I'll give you Galadriel. We'll go our separate ways, right? It's very reasonable given the situation that they're in. So I think they do. I think they did a lot of groundwork and a lot of breadcrumbs, a lot of good setups, and I think it paid off well. The writing was really good from that perspective, I thought, throughout. There's some things that are kind of hand wavy especially in terms of like movements and times and how long it takes to get from one place to another and position of things, stuff like that. I'm willing to let a lot of that go for the sense of pacing. But also I think again, as with the first season, I think a lot of the dialogue was really good. It wasn't trite. There was a lot of subtlety to it. There was a lot of meaning beneath the words. And they do a good thing where they'll be talking about like some theme of what's happening in this moment with this character, and then they'll crossfade to another storyline, another thread, and you see how that theme also applies to the thread that they're crossfading to. So I did that a number of times. I thought they did that very well. I enjoyed seeing Tom Bombadil in this, playing an actual role in the story instead of the ridiculousness of the Fellowship of the Ring. I liked the Tom Bombadil character before anyone gets mad at me. When I read the books, I really liked Tom Bombadil. But then I have to say, by the end of the Lord of the Rings, the 3 books, I was disappointed that character never comes back again, never shows up. It's obviously this super powerful, long-lived character in the universe who could help at least with wisdom. And he's just kind of, doing his own thing. So I was kind of disappointed with that in the books. And I understand why Peter Jackson left him out of the movies, because it didn't really make much sense from a story perspective why that character is in there. So I am glad to see that they brought that character to life and gave him a role that I felt was still relatively faithful to Tolkien's use of him. It's like he's not, charging into battle. He's not wielding any great magic. He's just using his wisdom to guide someone along. I like how Gandalf was revealed. We kind of already knew that it was going to be Gandalf. You certainly had to assume that it was going to be him or one of the other wizards, right? And probably him, since he's the big one that everyone knows. And how he got his staff, I thought they did that well too. I really enjoyed that. But that's enough. I'm going to hand it over to you now. What do you think? What are your thoughts? And what did you like about this season?
I like all the things that you said. I think you pointed out some really wonderful strengths for this show. And I agree. I think season 2 is much better constructed than season 1. I think the pacing is better. And the reason for the story is better. You have all of the motivations are so clearly laid out. The goals. Last time we talked about how the goals were unclear for the characters. Now the goals are clearly laid out. And I think that really helped the story and helps us get engaged and want to follow along and see what happens. I would say, to me, by far, the thing that stood out as absolutely brilliant was the interplay between Sauron and Celebrimbor, or Anatar and Celebrimbor. The manipulation was magnificent. And it was so creepy to watch. I think the actors did such a phenomenal job. I think the writers did a great job setting up that manipulation. Like you said, it made sense as to why Celebrimbor was doing what he was doing and listening to Anatar and ignoring his doubts and the voice saying, this isn't right, this isn't what this should be happening. That was the highlight of the season. And every time the scene would flip back to Eregion and Anatar and Celebrimbor, I'd be like so excited because I'd be wondering, to what depths was Sauron going to go this time?
Yeah.
There are some parts of the story, obviously, that I think worked better than others. I think the Eregion part of the story worked really well. I think the Numenor part of the story worked really well. I think you pointed out exactly how the political situation in Numenor that I think was very weakly described in the first season is very strongly laid out in the second season, so that it makes all of the actions make sense and what's going on makes sense. And the threat, the conflict makes sense. And we can see where the people that we consider to be our heroes, how they're in danger, and we understand the battle that they're fighting. So I thought that was really important. I had mixed feelings about Gandalf and Tom Bombadil because this is the only part in this season where my knowledge of the lore was getting in the way of my watching the story. This is not how Gandalf arrived in Middle-earth. And so that was a little frustrating to me because I was really hoping that they would pick a different wizard to sort of showcase, because they would have had a lot more creative freedom with picking a different wizard. I can understand, again, like you said, why they would do it, because Gandalf is very well known. He's very beloved. He, will tie people to the story because they're already invested in him from the movies. But I found it distracting and a little disappointing when he revealed himself as Gandalf. It just was like, okay, that's not how the lore is. So I had to kind of get over that. The one thing I did appreciate was how they really focused more on the stranger and less on Nori and later Poppy in those scenes. So it wasn't about the Harfoots anymore, because that was one of the things that I found kind of distracting also in season 1, was so much attention paid to the Harfoots because they're hobbits or soon to be hobbits or whatever, rather than the story. This time they had that particular segment really focused on the stranger and what was going on with the stranger. And so it wasn't so much about, look, we have hobbits, but the hobbits happen to be here part of the stranger's story. And I thought that worked. Yeah, I think I think those are the things that really stood out most for me. Again, I liked this season so much better. It was very engaging. And I again thought that the Anatar-Celebrimbor dynamic was really brilliant.
Yeah, I agree. Even when Celebrimbor kind of realized how manipulative Anatar was, and then even after he knew he was Sauron, it's like he was still being manipulated by him. It's like, yeah, because of these choices that he had to make. I thought that was really well done.
I think probably the best part for me in this season was when, at the very end, Celebrimbor then turned the tables on Sauron and used his same form of manipulation against him and calling him the Lord of the Rings. Planting the seeds of doubt. There's a line from the Lord of the Rings novels, the story, where Gandalf says something to the effect of, it doesn't matter how powerful Sauron is, he is not above fear and doubt. And that's what Celebrimbor does, is attack that at the very end. And I thought, oh, that's such great writing. That was good writing. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, I agree. That moment, because you feel for Celebrimbor and you're like, oh, don't do this. But it's like you understand. And then finally at the end, when he's just like, okay, I realize where I'm at. I'm going to resist with whatever I have left.
Yeah.
And I'm going to throw it in his face. It's like, yeah, you're really almost cheering for him at that moment. I thought that was great.
Yep. Was there anything that you would have changed as a writer?
I think on a high level, one of the things that I was disappointed with was Galadriel in this season, because she was so much a part of the first season, and she was so agentive. She was probably like one of the most agentive characters in that season. But she had her mission, she had her goals, she was always doing things. And then in this one, a lot of her time was spent with no control. She was like a captive and kind of just being used in the background. Which, I guess at some point in the story that could happen, and then that's how they set it up. So I'm not sure how you would fix that. But she seemed so much more passive. I guess maybe seeing her trying to escape more or something. I don't know. But that was one of the disappointments I had. was just her whole storyline this time, her thread. And then another thing that stood out was I didn't understand, and maybe this was explained and I missed it, why the Galdrim, the minions of the Dark Wizard, right? They kept going after the Harfoots even after they knew where Gandalf was going. It's like their whole point was to like find Gandalf and get him, right? And they knew where he was going, and he was off on his own away from the Harfoots, but they're still going after the Harfoots. And I guess it was to use them against him, but it's like you already had him alone. I don't know. That seemed odd. Like they were just like laser focused on going after these poor little hobbit people. And I don't know that it was explained well enough for me. So I think all they had to do is make that clear again, is to say something specifically like, you know, we get these Harfoots and we're gonna torture them if he doesn't come along with us. I think part of it is because they never did that. I think if they had gotten the Harfoots and had them at knife point with him there and forced him to do something, but we never really got to see that this time. We kind of saw it before, but so that was one thing. I don't know. There's probably more. Those are the two things that popped out to me as I was watching. Is there anything? First of all, what do you think about those? Do you agree with that?
Oh yeah, no, I agree. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I think was something I would have liked to have seen changed in the story was the Dark Wizard elements. I think the whole hide the ball play in the first season of who the stranger is and who's Sauron and that kind of thing did not help the story. And I feel like they're kind of doing the same thing with the Dark Wizard. Is it Saruman? Is it somebody else? You know, I think if they just sort of laid it out, that made it clear that the stranger is going to Rune in order to bring this other Istar to justice, Istar bounty hunter or whatever. Well, I think just laying out what the stakes were with that Dark Wizard very clearly would have served the story better and not played hide the ball with who he is and what he's doing again.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I agree with you. And I think that's part of the reason why. And no, you're right. I don't recall there being an explanation as to why they're going after the Harfoots, except if only just to almost like turn the stranger to the dark side by engaging his fear and anger or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I do like, though, that Gandalf was presented with this offer of temptation by the Dark Wizard. It's like, no. Yeah. I'm not going that way. I do like that he stood up. Like we get like, okay, yeah, he's completely on this other side now, right? Which I guess we kind of already had. But it was a nice moment. I do wonder, what's with the vagueness of the Dark Wizard, because as someone who's only read and seen Lord of the Rings, as far as I know, it's just Saruman. But it's like Saruman wasn't turned, as far as I know, in the past, because Gandalf is surprised when Saruman turns in Lord of the Rings. So. Right, if it's him, that seems like a weird setup. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure why they're making it mysterious either. That I don't think that's necessary. Just say who the person is.
A couple of other things that I wasn't crazy about was we lost Bronwyn, who was a very strong and interesting character from the first season. As I understand it, the actress chose not to return, which of course is her choice. But so they had to kill her off. And obviously, I mean, I don't know how a writer would otherwise handle this, right? It just, you can't, right? So you just got to do what you have to do. But it did feel abrupt and didn't seem to have much of an explanation. She was just dead. But what it did, unfortunately, was put into very stark relief the seeming purposelessness of the character of Theo.
Yeah.
In the first season, it kind of looked like he might have some kind of important role to play because he found the sword hilt and he figured out how to use it. But other than hiding the sword and arguing with Arondir and sort of not seeming like a nice person with his mom, he doesn't seem to have any real purpose in the story. You know, I'm thinking right now about how he was with Galadriel after Mount Doom exploded and they were making their way through the ash-covered forest. And he almost seems a little bit like an NPC in a video game helping the player move forward. I don't know. Anyway, so
no, yeah, I think you're right. That's a good point.
There seems to be some directionlessness with Theo that I think needs to be clarified. And maybe they don't know. Maybe they had a plan for him and that changed. I don't know. But it just sort of seemed that way to me. And I have almost the same feeling with Aarion. She seems convenient. She's conveniently there to throw the queen under the bus when it suits her purposes because she likes Farazan and has a crush on his son. I don't know. Which, by the way, that guy is such a loser.
Yeah.
You have to really question Aarian's taste in men.
Yes.
And then she turns around and saves her family when she was glaring at them, just a couple of episodes ago? So she seems to be a little convenient. She's in the right place to learn about the Palantir. Then she's like in the right place to throw the queen under the bus. Then she's in the right place to save her family. She also seems a little purposeless to me, other than as a plot convenience to help things move forward. And maybe something different will happen, like in season 3, that really kind of ties things up and makes everything that happened before make more sense, which is possible. So that would be my things. I thought this season went really, really well. There was just some things that felt a little bit unsure. I guess that's the right word I want. Felt a little unsure about the purpose of what these characters were doing, and that's Theo, Aarian, and that dark wizard. So that's about it.
I don't disagree with any of those comments. I do wonder, like you said, where Theo is going and what's his point, especially now that his mother is dead. It's like they almost could have just dropped his character at that point too.
Yeah.
Sorry, kid. Your mom's written out and now your character doesn't make sense. Yeah, I was expecting something more with him. Maybe they'll bring something to fruition in season 3. The other character, was there Eowyn? How do you say her name? Not Eowyn.
Aarian.
Aarian, yeah. I mean, I guess I see her point, right? She's tied to these characters that we're following, right? The queen and the captain, whose name I forget. So there's some connection there, right? But she's working kind of on the other side. But when those characters are faced with death, in particular her father, she has a conflict then. So I find that interesting. I think it's laudable that she's at least trying to save him at that point. And I think it's good to have someone who's kind of straddling both sides, as opposed to just being, here's a dark faction, here's the light faction. So yeah, we'll see if she plays a more pivotal role to come.
Yeah. Did you come up with any themes for Rings of Power season 2?
That's a good one. Good question. I had an easier time coming up with themes for the first one because I feel like more of the characters whose threads we were following kind of had themes that were more in line. This one, was like, this was sort of like The Empire Strikes Back, right? Where it's like the dark side's coming to power again now. The one that stood out to me, and I guess it's because I saw this with a couple of the characters, like King Durin and with Celebrimbor. Right at the end, ultimately, they stood up and took responsibility for their actions. They realized they went down the wrong path and accepted that. So I guess it would be accepting responsibility for your actions is required before you can be forgiven or before you can move forward. Or, I mean, they both died, so they didn't really move forward, I guess. But something about accepting responsibility was what I would get from them. But I didn't have anything specific. What about you? What did you find?
I actually have something very similar, and I think you're on the right track as far as like finding sort of the common thread for all of these characters. And I had beware choosing ambition or what you want over choosing right. Because a lot of these characters, that's what they did. So Celebrimbor, he was all about meeting or eclipsing his grandfather, Feanor's fame as a
his
smith.
Legacy, right? Yeah.
His legacy, exactly. So he was allowing his ambition, what he wanted, to blind him to all of the doubts that he had related to Anatar. Similarly, Adar, he wanted to beat Sauron, destroy Sauron, so that his people could live free. And he was ignoring all of the warnings he was getting, primarily from Galadriel, that bringing the orc army to Sauron was a big mistake. Because he was choosing his ambition, what he wanted, over the indications that this maybe wasn't the right way to do it. The elves in Lindon, right? They have question about whether these rings are really a good idea or not, because they were crafted with the help of Sauron. But they're so wanting to stay in Middle Earth and keep the tree alive and keep their ability to stay in Middle Earth alive, that they're willing to risk contaminating themselves with Sauron juju and use the rings. So they're all making choices. And in that particular case, okay, maybe that worked, but still, they're all making these choices to do that. Pharazôn, you pointed out that the reasons for Pharazôn's coming to power makes sense from the standpoint of keeping the island secure and what's going on. But he really just wanted to not die. In the first season, you see him standing over the deathbed of the king saying, we're going to have to build a tomb for him because that's the only immortality we can give him because we're all going to die, right? He's like bitter about it. So what he wants is to not die. And so he's letting his ambition and his desire run the show of taking over for Muriel. So you're just seeing this over and over again. This theme of choosing ambition and ignoring right, which I think goes to what you were saying about
just taking responsibility
right.
for
Thank
your
you.
actions.
Right. So if we're taking responsibility, because responsibility is understanding what's motivating your actions. I think that was the theme. Choosing.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Yeah. Beware choosing ambition over what's right.
Yeah. Something else that I thought of, this is not necessarily related to theme, but I thought it was interesting as you were talking with Adar, bringing the army there and Galadriel warning, like, no, this is what he wants. It just shows like how insidious the manipulation of Sauron is, right? They're going to question every single decision they make.
Yes.
Right? Wait, is this what he wants us to do? Are we playing into his hands? That's just brilliant.
So as a writer, what do you take away from Rings of Power Season 2?
Oh, man. I think there's a lot to take away from here. For me, I guess I would say just focusing on where you're going, right? Knowing where you're going and crafting the necessary steps to get there such that your characters' actions and motivations are believable. I think they did that so well, and I think that's my big takeaway.
Yeah.
What would yours be?
I think one of the reasons this season works so well is because Sauron, as you just pointed out, is a fantastic villain. And he is described in Tolkien's writings as a very manipulative character. But they've taken that manipulation and really added so much depth to it and then used it in such a wonderful way that he isn't like a mustache twirling villain. He is a truly scary villain because of his manipulative skills. And I think, to me, we talked about how that dynamic between Sauron and Celebrimbor was just such a highlight for me. I would love to be able to recreate that kind of dynamic with a villain and a character and have that villain's machinations be so, I don't know, just so brilliantly done.
Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah. That was wonderful. Because I was thinking that when you were talking there, like how much more interesting this Sauron character is versus the one that we see in Lord of the Rings, which is basically just evil, glowing eye, going to destroy Middle Earth kind of thing. Like, I mean, that was cool for that story, but this character is so much more interesting. And we get to see his transformation, which I think they delivered on the promise that I saw at the end of season 1, where he's a captive, and you're like wondering, how does this guy become this great leader, this great ruler over the world with, controlling all these rings and controlling everybody. And it's like, we get to see that. And it's so much more interesting, so much cooler. And like you said, with when Celebrimbor at the end says, he calls him the Lord of the Rings and says, you're going to be as much a prisoner of these things as anyone else that you've created. And we see him walk away, and he normally has a little smirk that he does when he walks away. And this time it's just a hint of like a questioning frown of like, oh, wait, is there some truth to what he says? We get to see him doubt himself. And I thought that was just brilliant. So good.
Celebrimbor planted that seed of doubt. And it was great. It was really great.
It was excellent. One thing I noticed from from both these seasons and delivered in this season in particular, and hopefully this continues into the next season, is you see a difference when you have a quality writing team here, really looking at the story and building things up and paying them off, versus some of the, I won't be specific, I guess, but some of the blockbusters in recent, let's call them large franchises, where you look at the writing, it's like, did you just like write this over a weekend and now you spent like $300 million making this movie? Like, the quality is so much more noticeable. It's like, look at what can be done if you take it seriously. And I'm impressed by a lot. We pointed out some issues with the story and the writing, and I think other people can probably find more. But overall, they did such a good job. What they did right, they did it really, really well, and I'm impressed by that.
Thank you for joining us as we talked about the story told in the television series Rings of Power Season 2. We want to give you a heads up that the Stories Told podcast will be going on hiatus at the end of November. For 2 weeks, we will not be posting any episodes, so if you don't hear from us for a couple of weeks, fret not. We will be back once that hiatus is over. A big thank you to our Patreon supporters and all our subscribers. We're so grateful for your support and your encouragement. The Stories Told podcast is available on multiple podcast platforms, and we thank you for liking and subscribing or following, depending on where you're listening. It may not be a big deal to you, but it means a lot to us. If you have a favorite book, movie, or TV series you'd like to suggest for the podcast, leave a comment on the YouTube channel, and that link is in the show notes. You can find Michael Grayford at michaelgrayford.com and E.W. Barnes at 1000years.com, and those links are also in the show notes. Join us next time as we talk about the story told in the television series Agatha All Along. Thanks so much, Mike. This was a lot of fun.
Yep, this was great. Thank you.
And we'll see you next time on the Stories Told podcast.